are a landscape photographer and you're looking to visit the Hawaiian Islands, well, what island should you visit? What areas should you have on your list? And what gear should you be bringing with you? So to start with, I'm going to give you guys a quick island breakdown so you can kind of understand what the different islands are and why people would go to a specific island over another. Then I'm going to break down my top 5 locations specifically for landscape photography. And then after that, I'm going to tell you which of those islands I would go to if I was visiting for my first time. The first thing you need to understand about the Hawaiian Islands is that technically there are 137 different small islands that are all considered part of the territory of the US state of Hawaii, but really there's only about 8 of the big islands that people are usually referring to when they say the islands of Hawaii. Now of those 8 islands, there are really only about 4 that make up 99% of the images and videos, and when you hear people talk about the islands, it's usually one of these 4 islands. Now, a couple things you should know about these 4 islands. Oahu is definitely the most popular island. It's where Honolulu, the capital of the state of Hawaii, is located, as well as most of the tourist attractions like Waikiki, the Polynesian Cultural Center, as well as the campus of BYU Hawaii. The island of Hawaii is the largest of the Hawaiian Islands, which people usually refer to as the Big Island or Kona in order to avoid confusion. This island is home to Hawaii's Volcanoes National Park, as well as Mauna Kea, which is the tallest mountain in the islands of Hawaii. Next, you have the island of Kauai, which is the oldest of these islands and home to the famous Pali Coast, as well as Waimea Canyon. This is definitely one of the most rural feeling islands, and they actually have a really interesting state law there that says none of the buildings there can be any taller than a palm tree. And finally, you have the island of Maui, which is a very, very popular vacation destination and home to the very famous sliding sands, which most of you will recognize from this photo here, used by Apple to advertise the capabilities of the new iPhone 14 Pro camera. Alright guys, so here it is. This is what you came for. The list of locations specifically I would recommend as my top 5 for landscape photographers. We're going to go through these locations, and then we're going to go through and maybe break down which island I would go to if I could only visit one of them. And number 1 on my list specifically for landscape photographers in Hawaii is the Pali Coast. I mean, come on guys, if you already know what it's like or you've been there before, you know that there's absolutely no good list of places to go and photograph things in Hawaii that does not include the Pali Coast. So I mean, come on guys, you already knew this was going to be number 1 on the list. The Pali Coast is a collection of insanely steep and jagged cliffs that jet directly out of the ocean. Seriously, this has got to be the most insane place I've ever been, and I would highly encourage anyone who gets the chance to go and see it at least one time. Now, there are actually 4 different ways you can go and see and photograph this coast. Number 1 is going to be to drive up to the state park, which is located on top of the coastline itself and kind of looks down at these cliffs toward the ocean. Now, this is a really, really common angle you'll see people photograph this from. There's usually tons of ads and different videos and stuff that are filmed there, music videos. There's a ton of different footage that gets filmed from that upper area. The only thing you have to worry about is sometimes there's some fog that rolls in, and that can obstruct your view where you can't really see that much, but it can clear out really quickly and make for some really cool atmosphere for your photos. Now, the second way you can see the Pali Coast, which I actually strongly recommend probably the most, I think it's probably the best way to see the Pali Coast, is to take a boat tour along the coastline. These boat tours are crazy. They're just probably one of the most wild things I've ever done in my life. They'll take you right up against the base of these cliffs, even though the water is really choppy and crazy most of the time. They'll even take you back through some of the narrow and kind of crazy caves that are down there along the coastline. Some of these tours will also take you up where you can have like lunch on one of the beaches, or they'll even let you swim with some dolphins right there on the coastline. Now, one thing you should know about these boat tours of the Pali Coast is the coastline there is infamously choppy. I mean, the water there is just crazy all the time. So if you go in one of the winter seasons, there's a high likelihood that your boat tour is actually going to get canceled. That's because the waves just get too big and way too dangerous for the boat tours to actually go out. That actually happened to us twice when we visited, so the third time we did finally make it all the way out there on the boat tour, and pretty much the entire time the water was just insane. Constantly choppy, constantly wavy, so if you do one of these boat tours, just be prepared. Most of the time the water there is pretty crazy and you're just going to get tossed around quite a bit. Now, there is actually a boat tour company called Captain Andy's, which sort of specializes in taking photographer, influencer type people out to that area of the Pali Coast to get photos, that sort of thing. And those guys are actually really cool. So if you need a recommendation for a boat tour, I highly recommend those guys. If you want to check them out, I will leave a link to their Instagram and their website down there in the description. Now, the third way you guys can experience this coastline is actually to hike it by taking the Koloa Trail. Now, this trail is not easy. It's a very long, strenuous trail, and there can be a lot of wind and rain, so just be prepared for that sort of thing. It can be slippery. Certain times of the year, it's not really that easy to do the trail, and I do know sometimes they actually close this trail down because of weather conditions, but the trail actually goes all the way from one end of the coastline to the other, so if you're looking for a really intense, probably multi-day trail, that's a really awesome one to do, but you are right up against the base of these cliffs, so although there are some good photos there, you can't really get out away from the cliffs like you can with a boat tour to get some of the images I was looking for. Now, one quick note here, you can actually fly your drone in certain areas of the Pali Coast, but you need to be very careful because pretty much anywhere in Hawaii, there are a lot of no-fly zones and there's a lot of flight paths for helicopters and airplanes, that sort of thing. Another thing you'll run into is that there are actually a lot of military no-fly zones where you're not actually able to fly your drone. So you kind of have to be careful and do your research beforehand, but there are areas in the Pali Coast you can fly your drone and get shots that way as well. And the fourth way you guys can see in the Pali Coast is by using a helicopter tour. Now, these helicopter tours are pretty crazy. They can be expensive, but they are just one of the most insane ways to view the Pali coastline from really high above. Number 2 on my list of locations specifically for landscape photographers, I know I'm going to get some hate for this, is Alamana. Alamana is a shark tooth formation that stands independent from the really cool mountains on the southeast corner of Oahu. Now, some people might say, really, Alamana of all the places in the islands of Hawaii? But there are a few different reasons why I love this location. It just keeps coming back. It's that location that just keeps giving. I photographed this place so many different times and from so many different angles, and I think that's what's really awesome about it, is you have so many different compositions you can pick of this thing, and it's very beginner friendly. There's a lot of different locations where you can go to photograph this from. Now, a lot of the other locations on the island of Oahu that are famous, like the Haiku Stairs or Stairway to Heaven or Sacred Falls, have been closed down and they're no longer accessible by the public. So for that reason, this just makes this area that much better, where it's not likely to get closed down. There's not many ways you can really trespass or have any issues when you're photographing this formation. Now, just in general, that southeast corner is probably my favorite part of the entire island of Oahu, just because it has so many rich greens and blues. Alamana itself is accessible from every angle as well, which gives you a large number of different ways you can photograph it. They're pretty much endless. Now, some of the main ways I would recommend would be with a drone, by hiking it itself, which actually gives you some of the coolest perspectives looking down at some of the other formations. And of course, there are a lot of areas you can photograph it from nearby, and a lot of different hikes along those mountain ranges. You can get different angles of Alamana itself. In addition to that, the beaches that sit just right there behind Alamana itself, beaches like Lanikai, they all have this really beautiful light blue water, so it just makes for all these different compositions you can get of this formation. It just makes it one of my favorite things on the island to photograph. Now, number 3 on my list is going to be another really well-known location on the island of Oahu, and that is Koloa Ranch. Most of you are going to recognize this area because a lot of it was composited into the background of some of the newer Jurassic Park movies. This area has been used as the background for a lot of different films. Almost every time you see some drone footage from somewhere on the island of Oahu, there's some clips somewhere in there from Koloa Ranch area. Now, what I really love about this place is that these crazy cliff faces meet the ocean almost directly, which make for so many unique compositions using the beach, the water. There's so many different opportunities here, and some of my favorite photos I've captured in the islands of Hawaii have been from this area. There's even a little island just off the coast of this area called Chinaman's Hat, and that also makes really good subject material for different photos. Now, number 4 on my list is going to be Tunnel Beach, located on the island of Kauai. This is such a classic shot where you can get a really awesome leading line using the beach and the shoreline, leading up to some really interesting jagged peaks. This area is also the starting point for the hiking trail that takes you back into the Pali Coast as well, so it's kind of a 2-for-1 where you can visit this area, shoot Tunnel Beach, and then if you are going to hike back into the Pali Coast, this is your starting point for that hike as well. There are some really awesome views from the very starting point of that hiking trail as well, looking back towards the coast where you can see some of these cliffs meet the sea. And finally, number 5 on my list is going to be the Pali Notches Pali Lookout area of the island of Oahu. This is back to my favorite part of the island of Oahu, back in that southeast corner. This is the area where the H3 highway comes through that famous tunnel, comes out of the mountain, and you have this really crazy view. Now, one of the most famous parts of this area is the Haiku Stairs, also known as the Stairway to Heaven, which has recently been closed, and they are actually removing the stairs that go up this area. So you can no longer access the Stairway to Heaven, but this area itself is still very photogenic, and there is a parking lot in an area called the Pali Overlook. This Pali Overlook actually has some really awesome scenic views. They aren't necessarily the most photogenic just from the viewpoint, but there is a hiking trail there if you're not afraid of heights that takes you up to some of the most extreme views you can get of that valley on that side of the island. And there you have it. There's my top 5. Now, it was really hard to make a top 5 because there are so many different places on these islands. Now, you guys will probably notice there are a lot of locations that I left out, some of them intentionally, because a lot of the areas in some of these islands are no longer accessible or open to the public. Sometimes you deal with issues with trespassing or different laws or regulations. So I wanted to pick locations that were easily accessible, beginner friendly, and you could photograph them a few different ways, different composition options. So whether that was from the ground or with a drone, or you could do it with a helicopter, all these locations are somewhat friendly to all of those different methods. Now, some honorable mentions that I didn't put in this list, but I would highly recommend as well, would be Waimea Canyon on the island of Kauai, Wailua Falls on the island of Kauai, Coco Head Crater on the island of Oahu, Diamond Head Crater on the island of Oahu, Blue Hole located on the island of Kauai, the top of Mauna Kea located on the Big Island, and Sliding Sands located on the island of Maui. So let's assume for a second that you were going to visit the islands, but you're really only able to visit one of them. Well, which one of these islands would I recommend you visit most to get the most out of your time there in the Hawaiian Islands? Oahu is great because it's very tourist friendly and it's very easy to navigate the island. A lot of these locations are easy to access. There's not a lot of hiking or crazy terrain that needs to be covered to access a lot of these locations to be photographed. Overall, Oahu is also a very well-rounded island, so you get part of that tourist vacation-style island experience as well as the ability to go photograph lots of different landscapes. Now, if you are solely worried about capturing absolutely the best landscape photos, I think pretty much everyone would agree that Kauai is going to be the island for you. The only thing about Kauai is that most of these locations are not as easily accessible. A lot of times you need to do a lot of hiking or have some access to some kind of helicopter tour in order to be able to photograph some of these locations. So what camera gear would I recommend you take with you to photograph the Hawaiian Islands? Well, obviously you're going to want to bring your DSLR camera, but the question is what lenses and what focal lengths are you going to use most often? Now, I found for the island specifically, a wide-angle lens usually ends up being very useful when photographing things like palm trees. I found that in most cases when I'm photographing a beach there on foot, it's really hard to photograph it with anything over about 35mm just because I'm not able to get those tall palm trees and everything else in the frame. So most of the time when I'm shooting on a beachfront, I'm using something like a 14mm. This is the Sony G Master 14mm 1.8. I think this is a really awesome lens for photographing those areas. You can also use a 24-70, but a lot of times 24 isn't wide enough. I will use the 24-70 a lot of times to compress some palm trees and bring in one of those mountains in the distance, but a lot of times I'm using something 70mm or higher, so 70-300 is another great lens. So if you can only take 2 lenses with you, you got to decide whether or not you want to shoot more telephoto stuff, but a 14mm or a wide angle lens and then some kind of 24-70 should give you a pretty good range of focal lengths there. Now, something that I think would be extremely practical when visiting the Hawaiian Islands is a dive housing of some kind, so like the Aquatech housings. Now, I don't actually have one of those, but that's something I'm definitely looking at getting because there are tons and tons of opportunities to photograph things underwater or partially underwater in the Hawaiian Islands. Now, next up, if you don't have a dive housing for your camera, obviously a GoPro is a great way to go. Like I was saying, there are a ton of opportunities to submerge your camera underwater. There's a lot of snorkeling areas, there's a lot of sea wildlife, but in addition to that, there are a lot of cliff faces that meet the sea. That gives you the opportunity to halfway submerge your camera and get a really interesting composition where you have the water kind of submerging part of your frame and then you have the mountains in the background. Those frames are really easy to capture on islands like Oahu and Kauai, so having something like a GoPro, something that you can get wet, makes a lot of sense. And probably the piece of gear I recommend having most is a drone. Now you have to be careful here because on the islands of Hawaii, there are a lot of military installations and airports, and because the islands are so small, there are a lot of flight paths that intersect with a lot of popular areas. So pretty much anywhere you go, there's going to be some kind of tourist helicopter or an airplane, or you're in a flight zone, or you're near an airport, or you're near some military land. So you really have to kind of be careful where you fly and what you do. You have to know the regulations and kind of watch the map before you fly there. But there are areas where you can fly your drone, especially at low altitudes, 100 feet or something like that, 200 feet. There are a lot of areas where you can do that and get away with it, especially on islands like Oahu. And you can get some pretty good photos that way. Now, in my opinion, a lot of the best photos in Hawaii are taken from really high above, so that's an instance where you'd probably need to get something like a helicopter tour. You can get up a lot higher and then utilize your DSLR camera. Use something like 24 to 70 or maybe 70 to 200 as a focal length to capture some of those images. And of course, there are some areas where you can do that with your drone as well. And one last note, something that I forgot to film in the last few clips, I would highly, highly, highly recommend more than anything else that you have a polarizer. Whether you're using a drone or you're using your DSLR camera, polarizers are probably the most powerful tool when photographing areas like this because it really helps you cut out glare on the surface of the water and get those rich colors in the ocean, as well as bring out those rich, vibrant greens. Polarizer is definitely my #1 tool, and I always have it on my drone, my camera, no matter what. When I'm photographing the Hawaiian Islands, I am always using a polarizer. I am a huge fan of Polar Pro. I don't think there's anything that compares to their polarizers. I pretty much use them exclusively. So you guys want to check out the polarizers that I used to make this video, I'll drop a link down there in the description to those as well. And that wraps it up for my top 5 for photographers in the Hawaiian Islands. Hopefully this helps you out if you guys have not been there before. Figure out what locations exactly you want to visit and photograph. Now, what do you guys think of my list? Do you think I got it right? Do you disagree with my list? Let me know down there in the comments which locations would make your top 5 in the Hawaiian Islands for landscape photographers. Now, I actually have something like 5 terabytes of footage from the Hawaiian Islands I've collected over the last few years, and this video really only scratched the surface of that. So there will be more Hawaii videos coming in the future, more top 5, top 10. Some of them will be more tourist oriented, and some of them will be photographer oriented. But if you guys are interested in exploring new places, whether that's Hawaii or Utah, that's what this channel is dedicated to, and I have a few other videos on my channel exploring Utah. And of course, I will leave a link down there in the description to all of the camera gear that I used to make and film this video.